How lame do you feel the so-called lame duck session is or will be? I mean, what's your outlook on both parties being able to reach a deal to avoid what's been known as the fiscal cliff?
Right. Well, I hope it's not going to be lame, that's for sure. And I'm encouraged, actually, by what I hear the first week we were back 2 weeks ago after the election, where I just heard really a dramatic kind of change among my colleagues in the House on the Republican side, a more willingness to allow revenue to be part of a budget balancing plan, deal, if you will. Democrats' willingness to make the necessary cuts and restructuring of entitlement programs. So I'm encouraged. Obviously, it's a lot of work to do for 2 months, and I don't expect that we'll be able to get all the T's crossed and I's dotted by the end of the year, but certainly, hopefully, set up an agreement that enables us to avoid the so-called fiscal cliff, which is a term given by Chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, for the automatic spending cuts that are scheduled to kick in at the beginning of the year because of the failure during the debt ceiling debacle last summer. These so-called sequestration cuts were, and I supported them because I didn't see any real willingness on both sides to reach an agreement to do what we have to do, which is to exercise more discipline. The challenging part is we have to make sure we don't do any harm to the economy in the short term, which is to say, to avoid dramatic tax increases or spending cuts in the short term that could push us back into recession, but to make sure over the long term that we make spending cuts and restructuring, tax reform that would get our budget back in balance.
So it sounds like there's more optimism now than there was before the election.
Oh my gosh, almost by an order of magnitude. Now, talk is cheap. I've obviously been trying to work across the aisle through a bipartisan policy group that I co-chair with my Republican colleague from Ohio, Jim Renacci. And he was energized as well when I saw him for the first time after the election. And I think that members have heard from their constituents, and their constituents back home have told them, stop fooling around. It's time to work together. We're tired of this Democrat and Republican posturing. We have really serious challenges facing us at the end of the year. Large tax increases on everybody if we don't reset those tax rates. And then the automatic spending cuts that'll kick in if we don't do something to avoid the fiscal cliff.
So do you see any likely scenarios playing out where if the fiscal cliff is avoided, it could be avoided in many different ways, either an entire agreement reached or kind of a piecemeal agreement where some issues are kind of kicked down the road still?
Yeah, it's really going to have to be a step process. I hate to use the term kick down the road because that implies avoiding the issue. I mean, there have to be, much like, the sequestration cuts, these automatic spending cuts, the so-called fiscal cliff, are having the intended impact. The idea was they would force either cuts or force us to act. And what we're finding is nobody likes the automatic cuts because they're blind and indiscriminate and would hurt people and put people out of work. And so let's do something that makes more sense. And so they're forcing us to act. So I would envision something that's a two-step process where we agree on the framework for an agreement, spending cuts on one side, new revenue on the other side, maybe targets for certain kinds of tax reform that met a certain framework, and then allow the respective committees to do the detail work over a period of time in the next year. But it's got to be, it can't look like Congress is avoiding its responsibility. It can't look like we're kicking the problem down the road. It has to be real. And we'll know, the financial markets will react to whether it's real or not, and it will have a very positive or negative impact. I'm very optimistic. I think the economy and the country is at a real crossroads, and if we get this right, which I think we can and will, it'll set the stage for much stronger economic growth in the future. We have the prospect of greater energy independence with new domestic sources of energy. lower cost energy, which is good for U.S. manufacturing. We've gone through a very difficult deleveraging process in the country, and it's been very painful, particularly for those who've been out of work, and in particular for folks who've been out of work for 6 months or more. But I think this stage is really set for a incredibly strong turnaround.
So, do you feel?
But we've got to get our work done.
Yeah, no kidding. Because last time this happened, I mean, last time, they were dealing with the debt ceiling, resulted in the U.S. losing its triple
Yeah.
credit rating. So I mean, certainly.
So I think that's the markets, the rating agencies have already said that if it looks like we're kicking the can down the road, they will downgrade us further, and that would be a bad thing. And so everybody wants to avoid that.
It's tough to imagine that road being
Yeah,
taken.
they don't want that to happen.
Do you feel that negotiations about the debt ceiling will prevent this Congress from taking up other issues moving forward on issues like postal reform or the Farm Bill, for instance?
Well, those are two real, I'm glad you mentioned both of those, because those are issues where the Senate has acted and the House, where I serve, has not. We should have passed the Farm Bill already. It passed out of committee in the House, with an overwhelming majority, Democrats and Republicans voting for it. Some pretty significant changes in foreign policy, but it's a bill that needs to come to the floor and get a vote, and I think postal reform the same way. There are bigger differences, I think, on the solutions for the Postal Service between the House and the Senate than in the Farm Bill. But those are things that, in my view, are not irreconcilable. And it's really important for the people who work for the Postal Service and for all the folks who get mail.
But at this point, it seems like the monomania right now is...
I think that's right, but their leadership has to fill in other time with bills, and those are two really important ones that, in other words, while the negotiation is happening, you got to do stuff. The rest of us have to do things. And those are two important pieces of legislation that could be worked on and passed in a lame duck while negotiations are underway and some of the details are worked out on the fiscal issues.
So are those the major three things that you'd hope to see?
Those are the big three, yeah. I would say those are the big three, neither of which really touch the committee on which I serve, Financial Services. We've been monitoring the Wall Street reform, financial reform that was part of the so-called Dodd-Frank Act, and we'll continue to do so. And the big issues there really revolve around the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which provide the secondary mortgage markets, which enable people to get 30-year fixed mortgages and really help housing in our country. And housing in our country and in the state of Delaware, particularly lower Delaware, has been in a depression, frankly, over the last couple of years since the housing bubble burst in 2007, 2008. So we have some important decisions that need to be made there to help bring the mortgage market back and to bring housing back. And when that happens, then we'll know that this recovery is really underway.
And so as your first term in office as representative comes to a close after this session, can you talk about what achievements, personal or within your party, you're most proud of?
Well, the thing that I'm most proud of is that I did what I said I was going to do when I ran in 2010, and that was to do in Washington, as I've always tried to do in Delaware, which is to work across the aisle to address these problems. I mentioned a minute ago the bipartisan policy group that I co-chair with Jim Renacci, Republican from Ohio. We came up with a number of legislative proposals from that committee, two of which at least, or three of which passed or became part of other legislation. One to enable emerging growth companies, make it easier to do an initial public offering, which is important for job creation, business development. Another one to reform or to enable states to have more tools to reform unemployment compensation, to enable businesses to use unemployment funds to actually hire somebody back which is the whole idea, to get people back to work, and then another piece of legislation that addresses critical prescription drug shortages that we have in our country, which is an increasingly severe problem. So that's where I've focused my time. We've had some success. We still have a lot more work to do. I'm very eager to pass the legislation that we talked about, postal service reform, farm bill, and then a larger fiscal plan that reduces the deficit by $4 trillion at least over 10 years and really puts the country on a path for a stronger fiscal future.
Is there an issue or agenda during this session that you feel was not addressed, you'd hoped had been addressed? That was sort of...
Yeah, there are a lot of them, frankly. We should have passed a big infrastructure bill. We've got crumbling roads and bridges and infrastructure across our country. We're at a point in time where we need to create jobs or to help private sector create jobs, and that's a perfect way to do that. In the short term, people ask me when I was campaigning all the time, what can you do, what would you do in the short term to create jobs? You're talking about things that are longer term, which is true. And one way to create jobs in the short term is to make money available to do these kinds of public works projects, which I think is really important. So I was frustrated by that. I thought that on the Financial Services Committee that the majority really didn't address the reform of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, didn't really address some of these mortgage issues. I understand that they're difficult and challenging. We've completely abandoned discussion at all about issues around climate change. I think we saw in our own state with this past Superstorm Sandy how critical our planning is going to be for sea rise and the climate change that causes it, and we got to stop denying that it's happening in our state and around the world, and try to deal honestly with the facts and focus on the hard part, which is, okay, what do we do about it? I wish we were spending more time on it. There's plenty to do. The biggest issue, though, is these fiscal issues. Chairman Bernanke and Secretary Treasurer Geithner were in our committee about 2 months ago, and they said, somebody asked a question about what we could do as members of Congress to help create jobs and strengthen the economy, and they both said unequivocally that the most important thing that Congress could do to help business create jobs is to create a fiscal plan, pass a fiscal plan that does no harm in the short term, i.e. avoids the fiscal cliff and the expiration of all the tax cuts, but gets our deficits under control in the long term with a target of about $4 trillion over 10 years, and that's what we ought to do.
So looking forward, do you feel like some momentum you've gained in the first term, you hope to kind of continue, keep pushing?
Well, the momentum has really been strengthened, I think, by what other members have told me they've heard when they campaigned and when they went back home, which is to work together, to compromise, to get things done. And that's the effort and initiative that I started with Jim Renacci, and the members of our group are really excited about going to work on some of these things where we think we'll have a better chance of getting bipartisan support, even though we did have some success.
So is there anything, new ideas, new plans, or initiatives that that people in Delaware might expect to see from your office in the second term?
Well, I think we will, what I'd like to do, and we did it once in the first term, was to take the fiscal issues out to the public, to get to do two things. One is to help educate the public to better understand the fiscal challenges that we face in our country, and the biggest issue there is health care and the exploding cost of health care. And I don't have to tell most people about it because they see it themselves personally, whether it's the business that they run or whether it's their increased premiums or co-pays that individuals have to shoulder. So I'd like to go out and to educate and also engage Delawareans on some of these fiscal issues. As I said, they're the most important that we're facing. I would like to also try to get our arms around some of these housing finance issues, which is important for the economy, I believe, and also important in the work that I do on Financial Services Committee.
In the next session, do you think there might be any more talk about a national park in Delaware?
Well, I would like to see that as well. I think there will be more discussion about that. The chairman of that committee has an interest in a national park, which would include some sites in his state. So our hope is that Congressman Doc Hastings will give greater consideration to our first state historic national park.
Well, Representative Carney, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.